Hallo und herzlich willkommen. Hier ist eine neue Folge von Radikal Glücklich, deinem Podcast für ein strahlendes, wunderbar, gut gelauntes Leben. Folge 240. Tracee Stanley, The Lumious Self. After a short German introduction, there will be the English interview. Ihr Lieben, heute habe ich einen sehr besonderen Gast im Podcast und zwar die wunderbare Tracee Stanley. Sie ist Yogalehrerin, sie war schon mal im Podcast, sie ist Autorin, ihr zweites Buch ist gerade erschienen, Link ist in den Shownotes, ihr könnt es euch direkt schnappen. Es heißt The Lumious Self, das leuchtende Selbst, und sie teilt dort wirklich auch einfach geschrieben, selbst wenn Englisch vielleicht nicht deine Lieblingslesesprache ist, sie teilt dort wunderbare Yoga-Rituale, Einblicke in ihre Praxis, in ihre Geschichte, wie wir uns befreien. Darum geht es, um uns zu erinnern, wer wir wirklich sind. Und es ist ein herrliches, tolles, tiefes Buch, genauso schön wie ihr erstes Radiant Rest. Ich wüsste nicht, wie ich mich entscheiden sollte zwischen den beiden. Zum Glück habe ich beide. Und im Podcast heute sprechen wir darüber, wie wir uns dekonditionieren, sodass wir unsere wahre Natur wiederfinden, wie wir uns auch in Partnerschaften oder in der Familie, wie wir uns um uns kümmern und um unsere Lieben, was so ihre Erwachungsmomente waren, wie sie mit Meditation umgeht, die Gratwanderung zwischen Disziplin oder also auch mal sein lassen, wenn wir uns nicht so fühlen. Es ist ein wunderbares Gespräch geworden. Ich hoffe, du hast genauso viel Spaß wie ich bei der Aufnahme hatte. Ich hoffe, es inspiriert dich, eine Praxis zu finden für dich, Rituale zu finden, die dich mehr zu dir führen. Und ich kann dir ihr Buch sehr ans Herz legen. Es ist eine wunderbare Anleitung. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören bis hierhin. Hab eine tolle Zeit. Bis bald. I am so happy to have her on the podcast again. Welcome, Tracee Stanley. So great that you are taking time for a little talk with me about your new book, which I have already in my hands. It's just out right now, and it's called The Luminous Self. So welcome, and maybe you want to say hello and introduce yourself really quick with some own words.
Yes, thank you so much, Yola. I am very excited, first of all, to be back with you again, because we had such a lovely talk the last time about my book, Radiant Rest, a couple of years ago. And what I would say is I'm a person who has been on a spiritual journey for several decades. I've been really honored and very grateful to have received a lot of very deep teachings from people who were also steeped in their teaching and practices over the years. Most of my foundational practices come from the lineages of Tantra. And those practices have been so transformational and activating for me, and also restful for me over the years. So I'm just here as a seeker, sharing the things that have been powerful for me. And that's kind of where I am today, this morning, as you're asking me to introduce myself.
Thank you. Yes, I love your book, Radiant Rest. It has improved my ability to rest a lot. So that was wonderful. And it has sharpened my view on the power of rest and how often I try to escape it.
Yeah.
And so I was really eager when I heard there's a new book coming to talk with you and to have it in my hands already was a great gift. It is your new book is called The Luminous Self. And I already admitted that I didn't manage to read all the book because it is in a good way so dense, full of practices. I feel it's more a companion over a longer time than a book you just read alone.
Thank you.
First of all, I would really love to hear what was your what is your mission with that book? What is what you want to awaken us up to? You said you share we are all seekers, and I feel like we're all sharing maps. I think Ram Dass said that once. And so what is your map? Just a little.
I love that question. My map that I'm trying to share is really the path inward to our essential self. That we're not, hopefully, we can let go of the distractions of looking externally for the essential self, for our true nature, for our luminosity, for our inner knowing, for our power. That when we turn our gaze and our attention inward, we can kind of move away from this place of distraction and move more into devotion, of kind of finding who it is that we really are. So that's really what my mission is to really share the practices that I think open the portals to just tasting a little bit of our true nature.
Yeah. Yes, wonderfully said. So as I read the first pages, some words really came deep into my heart. I don't know if I say the right words, but it really touched me deeply. That's right. Because you describe ourself as this luminous capacity or not as an essence that is always there, and we can get in touch when we lessen the distractions and when we commit to some kind of practices that guide us there. So that really touched me deep, because I think we all long for this belonging, and we oft tend to forget that it's a belonging in ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, that's such a powerful statement that you just made there, because yes, it is about belonging. There's so much loneliness in the world. I think especially highlighted after the COVID-19 pandemic, right? That there's loneliness, there's separation, there's polarity, there's division, and it all has this way of making us feel as though we don't belong. And if that's not enough, the overculture is constantly sending us the message that you don't belong. You're going to miss out. If you miss out, you're going to be behind. You're going to fall behind. All of these messages are constantly coming at us. And so when we have the time and the inclination and the devotion to be with our practice, what we start to feel, not just know from an intellectual place, we start to feel and trust that we belong to ourselves, that we belong to the universe, right? That we belong to the earth, and that we are part of the earth. And that when we are actually in that right relationship with the sense of belonging, our family starts to expand. Our connections start to expand. Our heart starts to expand. And then we start to realize that we're connected to all the beings. And that is a life shift. That's a reframing of belonging that I think is something that we could all benefit from. I think it would really shift a lot of things in our society.
I totally agree. And I love the analogy. And yesterday, I have to tell this little story. Yesterday, I was doing my workout routine, and I love to hear a podcast during it, because then time moves faster. So the things when I sweat and everything, I like it when time moves faster then, and I get a little distracted. And I listened to Eckhart Tolle, a podcast from him, just a random one. And now you mentioned this, and he was talking yesterday about the soul of the earth. I was listening and said that we are, that the soul of the earth is consciousness, the same as we are, as our soul is, and that we need to dive into that consciousness. And while I was running, I was remembering that in your book, there's also a lot about the earth holding us, and us giving ourselves back kind of to the earth. I don't know if you would do say it that way, but I know you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that you received that wisdom from the book and then felt it in your own body and then remembered it and then released it as your own knowing, right? This is what is so powerful about sharing practices and sharing things that have come through. And so I love that idea of the soul of the earth. I believe that Thich Nhat Hanh also talked about this idea that the consciousness of the earth is our consciousness, and our consciousness is the consciousness of the earth. And so, some of the studies that I've done in spiritual ecology really talk about this idea that if the earth is ill, which it is, then we are also ill. That we cannot be healed unless the earth is healed. There is no separation. And so that extends not only to the earth, but the collective at large. It's like just because we feel great doesn't mean that there isn't something underlying that still isn't well within us because the collective isn't well. And it's one of the reasons why I felt it was really important to have community care practices as part of the book, so that as we're going on this individual journey, that we're also realizing that it's not separate, it's connected to everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. Okay, let's talk a little bit about community services for those who don't know your book yet. So what is your recommendation? What kind of thoughts and actions can we welcome into our days?
So community care is so interesting because it doesn't have to be, I think a lot of times when we hear the word community, we think about things on a big scale, right? We think about, the 50-person yoga class or the 20-person, group of people or group of moms. How can I get all of those people to come and practice? And really, to me, it's not about that. It's really about sharing with the people closest to you, your family, your best friend, your parents, whoever those extended family members might be. And maybe not trying to force them to do a breathing practice or to lay on the earth, but to explain, right? But to explain part of their journey.
Yeah.
And part of what's lighting them up and what's alive in them right now as it relates to their practice, because people will notice when you do your practice. That's really one of the best things that you can do for the people who are immediately around you. Because when you do your practice, whatever that is, when you have your devotion, you have your rituals, whether it's something that you do 5 minutes a day or an hour a day, people notice the shift. They notice that you are more calm, less distracted, more present, more loving, more compassionate. And they might not ask you right away what's happening, but they take notice of it. And I noticed this with my own bonus children, that when they were really young, they would watch me meditating and they would watch people coming over for fire ceremonies and practices and mantras. So this was something that they were used to. And as far as I knew, they were totally not interested in this. But then the younger one came to me when he was probably in like 7th or 8th grade and said, I'm really having trouble concentrating. Can you teach me to meditate?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And then the older one, who was like 17 or 18, his best friend had just broken up with his first girlfriend and was devastated. And he came to me and said, do you think you can teach him yoga nidra? I think he really needs to relax and be calm. And so these things have a way of permeating the environment, and it's really beautiful.
That is so beautiful. Yes, I think so too, that we shine a light every time we move, and we kind of decide what we are shining into the world. And people will pick up on our frequency and may sometimes get curious. I love the stories you shared. That's beautiful. And I think our impact is much bigger than we assume through all the little things we do, not through the big things.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I believe that's true. And so if we think about this idea of our positive impact, our loving impact, we also have to think about the impact that we have when we're not in alignment, when our frequency is not in tune with who we really are. When we share from that place of who we really are, I really believe that our impact is really powerful, and it's felt, even just with someone in the supermarket.
And it is kind of, plus it's kind of double hard to stay in the center. Sometimes around family, I think family can be the hardest tests on our connection to our true self, because ego and all our patterns sneak in so easily. Isn't it that way?
Yeah, I think Ram Dass talked about that as like if you think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family. But I think that also family gives us an opportunity, once we kind of understand some of the philosophy around samskaras, which I talk about in the book, the imprints and the impressions, the things that have happened to us over time that we file away as good, bad, or neutral, that eventually cause a coloring. And that coloring really starts to become our habits, and the habits eventually concretize and become personality. That we get a really good, if we can be in the place of non-reaction, right, which definitely takes the practice of kind of leaning back in a more restful place and observing, there's a lot for us to learn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay, let's go to the samskara and to the imprints we get. And you share a very intimate story that really shook me when I read it, about the girls and the eggs in the bus. And you share your own journey with that story and with that imprint, and what it did to you, and how to free yourself with practice and without blaming or putting guilt on you or others. So I thought that was really beautiful. Maybe you want to share a little from that story and your and how it connects to your own path and awakening, as I might call it.
Yeah, I think I'll let readers read the story, but what I will say is that there was a moment in time where I realized that I was stuck, right? I was stuck in this way of wanting to be small, not wanting to be seen. And I was in a place at the time where I had a very successful career. And I was also practicing yoga, thank goodness. And through yoga, I was aware of the practice of vichara, which is a practice that is kind of defined as, there's many definitions, but one of the definitions is this idea of deliberation, deliberating on something until you find the source or the cause. And so I did this practice of deliberation around this wanting to be small, wanting to be quiet, wanting to be invisible. And it led me back to a moment decades earlier when I was in middle school of being bullied. And that I was then able to kind of sit with that moment and write and journal around that time, and realize that that moment was a defining moment in my life where I started to become small. I let go of the things that were really important to me. I didn't want to be seen as different. I didn't want to be seen at all. And what I realized is that I had been carrying the frequency of that moment forward into my life decades later, and that it was still informing everything that I was doing. And it's not to say that there weren't gifts, because I was able to also go back and find what were the gifts that came from that period of time, what were the gifts that came from that incident. But the kind of harm that happened and the negative thought constructs that were formed and the habits that were formed from that samskara, that impression, that moment, were overriding the good things. And so if I wanted to be free, I needed to start to free myself from that. And one of the things that I'm very aware of is that we don't have a lot in America because a lot of us have been separated from our indigenous cultures and our ancestors. We've been separated from our rituals, and we've been separated from rites of passage that, have happened over eons. And so as a Black woman living in America whose family was mostly raised in the Caribbean and somewhat in the South, we were enslaved and brought to these different places and completely separated from all of the rituals and religions and things. And so for me, I felt like, I need to create a ritual. I need to create a space that is going to be a demarcation from how things were before to how things will be going forward. I needed to create an active threshold, and I needed to honor that threshold with a ritual. And so I created a ritual for myself that would be the honoring of, yes, this is the old version, and let's honor that old version. But going forward, I'm moving forward with my gifts and not the pain from this experience so that I can let it go. And that really is the inspiration of the book, is to take you through all of these practices very slowly. As you said, this book is a practice companion. It's not a book that's like, hey, I'm going to sit down and read this in, a day. It's really a practice companion. There are many self-inquiry questions. There are practices that I suggest that you do for longer periods of time and sit with. There are practices and that will really start to shift and reframe things, I think, for people. And so the idea of the book is, how can you begin to harness all of the wisdom that you need from your past, from your ancestors, from the practices, so that you can create a ritual for yourself that will be healing? Because too often we're going to the outer kind of influences and outsourcing our knowing of what we need to heal in order to try to do the healing, when we have the answers inside. And sometimes we just need the right prompt or the right practice to help bring that to the surface.
Yes, that is beautifully said. Thank you. And I think it is easier for us when we have practices to stick to, because when I look at my own journey, I can see a tendency of not wanting to go into some of the challenging moments of my life where there was pain or shame or guilt. And I kind of want to skip over it, or just stay on the surface and move on quickly, be like heavy and light again. But when a teacher or a book takes me there and gives me the safety, which you do, you always create safe spaces in the practices I already read, then we can bend there. We can go to the place that once hurt, and today it will maybe hurt again, but it will hurt differently because we are already grown up and have moved on. And I think when we embrace some of our older parts and difficult moments with consciousness, when the light of consciousness hits those spots, then something changes, then we move on, I feel. So thank you for creating those practices. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I definitely agree.
So I have some personal questions, and you feel free to say, oh, I don't want to answer this one because we didn't talk about the questions I will ask to prepare this podcast episode. So I would love to hear, is there a moment you remember on your journey? Maybe there are several, probably, but maybe there's a special one you would like to share today, which kind of felt for you like, oh, that is consciousness. That's what they are talking about, this first contact. Do you remember that? You want to share it maybe?
Yeah, I can share one of the moments that happened in a yoga class. And it's a practice that I share in the book, actually. And the reason why I share it in the book is because it was so profound and very, very simple. This is a practice that is known as neti neti. And neti neti is described or translated sometimes as not this, not that. And sometimes it's translated as not this, not this. And I remember having done a very rigorous yoga class and then lying down in Shavasana and having the teacher just guide us through this practice of neti neti, which is essentially just being aware of what is in the field of perception. And when anything comes in, silently repeating to yourself, neti neti, and feeling and sensing that it dissolves. And what happened after just a few moments of doing this neti neti is this spaciousness just opened that felt like it was infinite. And in some moment, I definitely felt this blissful, easeful, restful space and frequency around me and in me, and that it was very hard to tell where did my body end and where did the floor begin. And at some point, it was like being in this space of hypnagogia, right? Where you're in the in-between, you're in the liminal. And at the same time, I was also aware that my body wasn't breathing. And I'm sure that I was probably breathing, but the breath was probably so shallow that it was almost imperceptible. And then at some point I came back, and I remember that being such a profound practice that I took it home and just started practicing it all the time. And so I think that practice created such a spaciousness and a connection and a dissolving of the ego, right? That it was a moment of like, oh, I am spacious awareness. And so if we think about this idea of not this, not that, that anything that comes in as a thought, as an image, as a color, as a sound, whatever it is, that you're negating it. It's really this practice of negation to come back to source, negating essentially everything that is not source.
Beautiful. And it's a beautiful practice, I can imagine, for even everyday life, because I don't know how it is for you. That's my next question, I think. But in meditation or in a beautiful yoga class or even in a retreat or after a sound bath, I can feel spaciousness and my mind is quiet, and which is beautiful. And I'm very happy that this is sometimes possible. But then there comes everyday life. And I distract myself, I'm aware of this. So how do you keep contact to your luminous self through everyday life?
Well, I think the understanding that the frequency is there, it doesn't go away. It's beyond condition, right? It's beyond our environment and the things that happen and the ebbs and flows of life. The ebbs and flows of life are always going to be there. There's nothing that we're going to do to escape that. But this is why this book is really about the remembrance. It's about the self-remembrance. So even in the toughest of times, if we can remember, even if we can't feel the frequency in that moment, but that we can remember that there is a part of us that is eternal, that is always bright. There's a part of us that is beyond all sorrow, as is said in the Yoga Sutras 136. And that if we can lean on that remembrance, because we have touched it, because we have maybe experienced a sliver of that awakening, that remembering, that in my experience has carried me, because it's an embodied knowing that no one can take away from you.
Yes. Oh, yes. Beautiful. So let's take a look into your book. So in the book, there are several beautiful practices which can accompany us a lifetime. And there's a whole passage about forgiveness, which I really love. And part 1, page 68, 69. And you talk about self-forgiveness, and there's a whole ritual around that. Self-forgiveness, which really touched me, and already did it once, loved it. So tell us a little about how forgiveness can open us more to the connection with our true nature.
Yeah, there was a song that someone reminded me of recently that I used to love to sing by Bhagavan Das, where he's singing to Kali. And he sings, "Take from me all that is not free."
Yes.
And it's really interesting because I feel that when I'm in a place, and I can only speak for myself, of not being forgiving, that it feels like a gripping. It feels like a blockage. It feels like an obstacle. It feels like a resistance, actually, to me experiencing my true frequency. Because there's this other frequency of the non-forgiving, the holding that is there. And so I think that we all have things that perhaps we might be considering forgiving someone for. And maybe we're not in a place to forgive. Maybe that person has done something so heinous that forgiveness is not an option in this lifetime. But we always have the option to be with ourselves and to forgive ourselves, because I think that a lot of times my experience has been when I need to forgive someone, the first layer of that forgiveness is the self-forgiveness, because there's some part that I have that I haven't forgiven myself for.
That is true. Yeah.
And so I think that this is a practice, the self-forgiveness ritual, which is really about creating a letter to ourselves. And this is not something that anybody else is going to read. So you can be free to really write about, what is it that I need to forgive myself for? And it has 8 steps to the ritual and a releasing of this as well. And so self-forgiveness, I think, is really important. And then once we have practiced self-forgiveness, then we can inquire into, where do we want to go next with that? Maybe that's where we pause for a while.
Yes, I love it. And when I went through that letter, when I wrote it, well, it is a very intimate moment we have with ourselves when we open ourselves up so much. And same time, there's like, on the next day, I felt like I want to congratulate me. It felt really like I was a little lighter, and I bought myself a beautiful bouquet of flowers to celebrate that, actually.
Beautiful. I love that. And that's exactly what I hope for people, right? Is to feel lighter
Yeah.
because you are carrying something when you're not forgiving yourself. And we all deserve to be able to give ourselves the gift of self-forgiveness.
Yes. Yes. It's a gift. Yes. So thank you for that beautiful practice, as there are so many. And this
Oh,
is.
you're welcome.
I would love to talk with you about the discipline to practice versus the softness of taking a rest of practice.
Mm. This is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Oh, I'm happy.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think that it's a very interesting journey. And my journey really is the only one I can speak of, but my journey began in this place of kind of jnana yoga, right? Is being very curious, very spiritually curious, reading every book, trying to seek out every, teacher, and finding a teacher who also was a jnana yogi, who we could say, definitely knew a lot and had practiced in a very patriarchal system, as a lot of lineages are, that have this idea of you have to do the practice, same time, same place, for, as is said in the Yoga Sutras, very regimented. And so I took that on. I took that on of like, oh, yes, I'm going to do this practice for 40 days. I'm going to do this mantra 125,000 times, all of the things. And what I noticed made me a bit uncomfortable is that within the Sangha, when we would gather, there would be people who had completed the practice, and there were people who had not completed the practice for whatever reason. And we know that life gets in the way. And there seemed to be this kind of hierarchy of, oh, you've got a gold star now because you finished the practice. And there was a bit of, not to say that the teacher themselves was shaming the students, but it was almost as though the students were self-shaming themselves, right, for not completing the practice. And it was like, oh, I'm a bad yogi because I haven't completed the practice. And I just watched how that really was like an erosion that began to happen within the community of like, oh, here are the people who do the practices, and here are the people who, oh, must be something wrong with them because they're not doing the practice. And I just felt that frequency of shame and the fear of not completing something, the fear of not doing it right. We already have that fear, and how the overculture really wants us to be in that space of afraid of not doing it right, needing to have somebody to hold your hand through it. And then you're afraid of disappointing that person. And how does that color the frequency of the practice? And so as I was in this place of being extremely disciplined and moving through practices, I also saw my own, as a teacher, inner questioning when one of the students that I was working with would say, oh, I didn't finish the practice, or I wasn't able to do it. It was like, well, why? Why not? This is what you're supposed to do. And as I started to move more into, I discovered the love of kirtan. And as I discovered this love of kirtan, it was really moving into this place of devotion and practice for the love of it. Sally Kempton has a book called Meditation for the Love of It, which is a beautiful book if anyone has not read that book. And it really shifted my relationship with my practice. My practice became much more devotional and much more soft. And what I noticed about my practice is that the fruits and the boons of my practice seemed to just come so much more easily because I had let go of that grip of discipline. I had been able to kind of soften the masculine edges of the practice that I had been doing, and the way, I should say, not necessarily the practice itself, but the way I had been doing it, the way I had been thinking about it. And that was just a game changer.
Well, that is a wonderful story on the one hand, and a good evolution, I feel, because I think in our society, with all the ego we got going on as humans, like we come with that programming of wanting to do stuff right, wanting to be part of groups, one craving accomplishment, belonging, as we said in the beginning of this talk. And that makes us not listen to maybe our own body or our own boundaries. And I feel it's a very personal thing to, on the one hand, stick to what you promised yourself. Because first of all, I think our practice is kind of a promise to ourselves we want to keep, and to a softness that sometimes we can feel that we need something else, and that is fine too. I'm still learning that. I have to say, I'm still learning that, because I got a good thing of when I did this, like kind of check marks in my practice, and I am still practicing to let go of that.
Well, I want to pull the thread of what you said about the practice when we commit to a sadhana, that it's a practice to yourself. I think that is devotion. That is self-devotion. But I think if it's framed as a promise to the teacher, or a competition within the Sangha, or I'm not going to be good enough if I don't do this because I have to, compete, or I have to compare myself, which I think is what really does start to happen. And I've seen that happen. And I've seen that be, I suppose, both good and bad, in the way of, not to talk in binaries, but, I remember there was someone new in the Sangha who had just started, and there was this very long mantra that people were learning. And this person came in and we were having a ceremony, and she just, beautifully was chanting the mantra flawlessly. And I remember one of the people in the Sangha was like, how does she know that mantra already? And that was the thing that kind of propelled that person to learn the mantra, because she didn't want to be, sort of outdone by this new person. So on the one hand, it's like, oh yes, it helped you to learn the mantra, but the impetus for learning it was the feeling of not belonging. So going back to the very beginning of our conversation, the feeling of not belonging, the fear of not belonging, was the thing that propelled you. And I think that's what needs to be kind of shifted, is that we're all in this together. We're all in our own paces. And that if we make a promise to ourselves, let that practice be the devotion to self, to the capital S self, without the ego.
Yes, totally. And I feel like when we talk about, as you said, the samskara, the imprints we have, some kind of our imprints seems like to fit into society and into the groups, and others don't. So does that make the one person a better one than the other just because the imprint is more socially accepted? Which also kind of would be a funny idea.
Yeah, but the overculture and industrialized society reinforces most of the imprints that have to do with, let's say, the kleshas, right? They reinforce our fear of of death, right? So there's a whole anti-aging marketing campaign for many, many products, that if we think about the anti-aging, it's really about fear of death. Right? We have attachments, we have aversions. There's all different kinds of things. We're being manipulated all the time by by these kleshas, because people know, marketing companies know They might not call them the kleshas. They might call them some other kind of psychological things, but we are being manipulated, which is why it's really important for us to understand how the kleshas show up for us in our practice and in our lives, so that we can just be aware and we can create a pause. We can create a putting a spoke in the wheel when we start to notice, oh, I'm nervous because this new person that just came to the job is staying in the office longer and coming to the office earlier. Is she going to take my job? Is she going to get the promotion before I get the promotion? When you trace that down, that is a fear of death. The fear of losing the job, the fear of losing the reputation, it boils down to that fear.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So,
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we can be aware of the kleshas and know that we're in the lila, right? We're in the play of life and all these things are happening. And it doesn't mean that we're bad or good. They are. And if we can become more aware of them, then we can begin to bring in some antidotes or some medicine for when they're taking over our lives in a way that is not life affirming, because we want to be in spaces with people, doing practices, thinking in ways that are life affirming.
You're talking about transitions, which kind of is embracing transition. There's one chapter called, and I quote you on page 103, this crossroads demands that we pause. And it's like, it's those transition points. That's what you call the crossroads, where we go across or not, and where we make our decisions. And I love that, and I feel it's kind of fitting into the talk we had about death, that our need for security, if we don't make ourselves at home in ourselves with practices like you share, I feel that if we don't create that profound security in our life, that safety for ourselves, which is without, it doesn't need anything in the outside, it's more inside, then we need to feel secure in our mind, and that makes us want everything to stay as it is.
Yeah, I really think that one of the most important contemplations that we can do is this contemplation on impermanence.
Yes.
Right? Is that no matter how we build our lives to be safe and secure, there's a factor of the unknown. There's a factor that nothing stays the same. And so when we do these contemplations around death and dying and what it means to us, it becomes more familiar territory to face, to think about, to talk about, to practice. And I think that is a shift that we all could use. You know, it's like anybody who has a garden knows that things don't last, that there are seasons. Anyone who has been with someone who has been on the journey of transitioning out of their body has a different understanding if you've been close and you've been paying attention. So this is something that I think is really important for us to be with. And it's not like we have to carry the contemplation all the time, but we should definitely take time to sit with it and be with the contemplation once a week. And then as you continue with that, then you start to see and feel and notice certain things. And then you see the impermanence that's around, and that becomes an acceptance. And for me, understanding what little I do about impermanence, it creates a more fulfilling life, because we recognize that our time is short and what we do with that time is really important, and who we touch during that time is important.
Okay. That's beautiful. So I got one last little story I found while I was preparing for this talk. It was the moment in part 2 where you share a beautiful morning on a retreat, feeling blissful, joyful, and meeting another person and feeling the connection on a profound, deep way. I can't explain it. It's beautifully written in your book, so everybody has to read that. Page 143. And then you say in the book that, well, your small self, your ego would have said, well, that it was love at first sight. But of course, when I read it, I have to admit, I was like, that's love at first, turning into a love story. And the romantic part of me loved it. I'm sorry.
No, but it's very true. It's very
I was
true.
like, oh, that's so sweet. And then you're like, wow, that's a small sample. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, well.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like it's true that my understanding of love became so different after that experience. That I feel like, oh, love at first sight is really the recognition of someone else's true self.
That is beautiful.
That to me is what love at first sight is. It's like there is something happened to part the way of spacious awareness where you saw into the heart of someone and they saw into the heart of you in that moment. And that has been my experience with my current husband. And I feel like we have those moments all the time. Like we just keep falling in love over and over and over by being in that spaciousness and the stillness to be able to see each other and to make time. So yeah, that was a very profound teaching that came from a place that could have been very painful, but the discomfort was the portal to that awakening. If I had not been in the discomfort of being heartbroken, I never would have had the realization that I was already whole.
Yes. Yeah, true. So that leads to the question, is your husband a yogi too? Sorry, when I get a little more gossipy now.
Yeah, let's get into the gossip. Well, what I would say is, first of all, he this is another example of just doing your practice and not, preaching about your practice. So I learned from my previous relationship, I'm not going to try to force my partner to do yoga. I'm just going to mind my business and do my own practice. And that's going to be that. They'll be on their journey. And funnily enough, not funny, but he would not do yoga. So I wasn't asking him to do yoga, but he had a back injury. And one of my teachers was Gary Kraftsow. And Gary Kraftsow has these videos for the lower and upper back. And I was going to a workshop in Seattle with Gary. And he was like, I think I want to go to this workshop. I'm like, oh, you mean you want to just come with me, and we'll go out to dinner after? He's like, no, I'm going to come and be at the workshop. And I was like, you're actually going to go to a 3-day yoga workshop? What's happening? So he went and he did this workshop. And ever since then, and then he told Gary about his back injury. Gary gave him a sequence of things to do. His back healed. And he has been practicing yoga every day. He has his own little routine. I don't get involved in it. He's been practicing every morning since then. And that's been about, I'm going to say at least 8 or 9 years.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And so he does his practice. And I think that a lot of his mindfulness, meditation practice also happens outside in nature because he takes these long 4 to 6 mile walks every day with our dog. And he goes and visits the horses on his way and the goats on his way. There's a little farm up the road just before you get to the hike. And so he's very connected to nature, and he's connected in a way that I think when we look at people walking in nature or listening to the trees, we don't think about that as yoga, but yoga is union. And we can think about the tantric teacher Dattatreya, who was the sage who had 24 gurus, and all of his gurus were aspects of nature, which I also talk about in the book. So I think there are many ways for us to be seekers. And for him, he's definitely on his path. And it's really beautiful to watch from afar and not have to meddle in what practice should you be doing and what, and just really be in observance and learning from a lot of what he shares and what he does. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's really chapeau to your discipline to not getting involved, because I remember when I started yoga lots of years ago, my husband and I weren't going out dating that long already. And I dived into a really rigid Ashtanga practice every morning. And I wanted him to do it so badly. So I took him to a workshop, and he was just like, no.
Yeah.
Hasn't done Ashtanga since that workshop. So I had to learn to keep my hands off dragging him into some yoga practice.
Yes.
Okay, Tracee, we are done with our beautiful hour together. I really appreciate the time you took, your teachings. Thank you for sharing in a book so that we in Europe can also participate from your teachings without far traveling. Maybe by saying goodbye, of course, your book is one of the books that will be in the show notes and where it's all about. But is there another book or a song or something you want to mention if people are seeking further advice or guidance?
Yeah. So one of the things that I recommend is, well, first of all, in the back of the book, all the chapters have notes. And a lot of those notes include different books that I think would be helpful. There's also a bibliography in the back of the book that has all of the things that I've, had as my resources. And then on page 185 is the recommended resources. And so there's the book from Ramana Maharshi, How to Practice Self-Inquiry. There's if you're interested in Avidya and the 5 Kleshas, the practice of the Yoga Sutras by Pandit Rajmani Tiganayat. There's the book on ancestors that I think is really amazing is The Healing Wisdom of Africa by Malidoma Some, and his other book of Water and Spirit, Ritual, Magic, and Initiation in the Life of an African Shaman. Beautiful. Dreams, Andrew Holichek has the book Dream Yoga, and Trauma-Informed Yoga, Gail Parker, Yoga, Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race-Based Stress and Trauma is the book for everyone, as well as Zabiya Yamasaki's book, Trauma-Informed Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Assault. And then I have a little list of therapists and some also Yoga Nidra resources. So yeah, the book is full of resources and other ways to point you in other directions after you read The Luminous Self.
Yes. So everybody just look into the back of the book. And your book is out now. So everybody who has been listening today to our podcast, go grab the book. It is all German-speaking people. It is easily written. You will understand everything. Don't have fear of the English language.
And it's also an audiobook as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And if there's any German publisher who wants to publish this in German, just reach out to Shambhala Publications.
Yeah, that is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So all publishers listening, write to my publisher, actually. I'm going to do that. Okay. Thank you for your work, Tracee.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been beautiful. Thank you for all who are listening, and I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all. And if you like the episode, go check out Tracee has a beautiful Instagram account too. Check her out. Leave us a note if you like it. We really appreciate that. Goodbye and thank you.
Tschüss.
Hey und pst, es gibt einen neuen Podcast von mir, der ursprünglich auf einer von mir geschaffenen Kursplattform nur zur Verfügung gestellt wurde. Er heißt Zurück zur Natur und ich beschreibe darin, wie ich ätherische Öle und Supplements nutze und was ich den Leuten, die das mit mir entdecken, rate. Wenn du also Lust hast, auf diesem Weg auch mir ein bisschen zuzuhören, dann findest du Zurück zur Natur überall da, wo du auch diesen Podcast findest. Viel Spaß beim Zuhören.